Good morning again. So good to see so many faces here this morning. And I enjoyed that beautiful music too. He leadeth me. Does God lead us from day to day? Yes. He certainly does. And this afternoon, I know the young people's meeting is going to be on Joseph. That's what the Genesis is about. And we're going to be talking a little bit about Joseph as well during this hour here. I had planned that a long time ago, and it just sort of meshed together, I guess. But it's a blessing that we can look at the life of Joseph and how that relates to us as well. Add to your faith virtue, not vice. Let's turn to Hebrews 11, verse 1. Hebrews 11, verse 1. I'd like to look at the word faith first, because faith comes before virtue. It says, now faith is the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen. Faith is essential for our salvation. We have to have faith. And in Hebrews, faith is mentioned about 31 times, just in the book of Hebrews. And in the entire Bible, faith is mentioned 231 times. There may be some other variances of the word faith, but 231 times in the entire Bible. So Hebrews has quite a number concentrated in that. And in verse 12, faith is the first round of the ladder. Let's look at 2 Peter, the book of 2 Peter. Verses 4 and 5. Whereby are given unto us exceeding great and precious promises, that by these ye might be partakers of the divine nature, having escaped the corruption that is in the world through lust. And beside this, give all diligence. Add to your faith virtue, and to virtue knowledge. So faith here is part of a process that we have. Many people stop with just faith. Yes, we are to have faith, aren't we? We are to have faith in the atoning blood of Christ. We're speaking about the sacrificial system this morning and how we must believe in the blood of Christ, how we must accept His atoning life for us. But it doesn't stop there. It continues on to a next step. Add to your faith virtue. Those who are seeking eternal life and a home in the kingdom of God must lay their character building on the foundation of virtue. Jesus must be the first cornerstone, chief cornerstone. The things that defile the soul must be banished from the mind and life. So as we face life and as we face things that hinder us from our Christian experience, those must be banished from our life. Now, what is the definition of virtue? Virtue is a strength. It's a moral goodness. It's something that is right in our characters. If we were to look at a particular circumstance, if we're tempted to do something wrong, virtue is resistance to that. So doing the right. Against the opposite of that is vice. Now, we can think of many vices. There is vice of smoking, there is vice of drinking, there's other vices that are not so prevalent, that are more subtle. These are also vices. That's the opposite of virtue. Now, I'd like to give an illustration. You know, we are surrounded in this world with difficulties and trials. And our lives are but a vapor. They're here today and gone tomorrow. And as we face the difficulties and the trials, how do we react? Do our lives crumble? Do we trust in Christ? As Christ covers us with his righteousness, his robe of righteousness, what is our life? Do we have any merits? And Satan comes along, and what's he going to do? He attacks us, doesn't he? And you all know what's going to happen. When he attacks us, what happens? We have the other one. And there is nothing in our lives. But what if we have Christ in our life? What happens? What happens? There's something different. Okay. Goes all the way through. Christ protects us. And there is virtue in our lives with Christ in our lives. Now that will eventually lose its air, I think. But virtue. Virtue is something that we must possess, each of us, for eternal life, and Christ gives that to us. It is the glory of God to give his children virtue. Now there's an expression that many of us are familiar with, and that is, sanctification is a progressive work. And sanctification is the work of a what? Lifetime. But surprisingly enough, that phrase is not as common as another phrase. That is, the formation of character is the work of a lifetime. So our characters are sanctified. And the character is really where our sanctification comes, is what character that we have. As we go through life, we develop that character. And it's every day that we form that character. The formation of a character is the work of a lifetime. Sanctification of character is the work of a lifetime as well. So I'd like to look at the story of Joseph today. It's one of my favorite stories. There's many favorite stories, I suppose, in the Bible. But Joseph is one of complexity, one of disturbing things that happen. And I know different trials that we face. Not just a trial, but heartaches that we go through. Joseph's story is full of heartaches. But yet, what happens through those heartaches? What do those heartaches create? How are they faced? It makes a difference on this. Let's turn to the story of Joseph in Genesis chapter 47. 37. And I would encourage, I'm sure that many of you have read these chapters this week, and the story of Joseph and his brethren. Joseph grew up as one of the youngest in his home. Only one was younger, and that was Benjamin. But Joseph was a beloved of his father, Jacob. He loved him very much because he was the son of his beloved wife, Rachel, that had died when she had Benjamin. But Jacob had 12 sons altogether. But Joseph's life was different than the other sons. he exemplified a more Christian, Christ-like character. He had an interest in spiritual things, and he listened to his father's instructions when he was growing up. But there's some things in Joseph's life that, in his early life particularly, that his character had flaws, had drastic flaws, because of the preference that Joseph had, he became exacting and self-sufficient. These are character traits that are deadly in a character. And it was evident that his father loved Joseph more than his other sons. And this created contention in the home and jealousy. And Joseph had a couple dreams. He dreamt that his sheaves as he was out in the field, his sheaf stood up, and the 12 sheaves around, or the 11 sheaves around, bowed down to his sheaf. And these were a couple of dreams that were recognized as meaning something by Jacob, but his brothers hated the dreams. They hated Joseph for who he was, and they hated him as a brother. Even though Joseph was kind to them, this jealousy increased. And then the children, the 10 brothers, went and fed their flocks in the country. And Joseph went to find them because it had been a long time since they had talked with their parents, or their father rather. And as Joseph came to them, the hatred could be seen in their eyes. And this alarmed Joseph. He recognized at that point the hatred that was there. And you know the story of how he was taken, put in a pit, and they didn't want to let him die in that pit, but they did something much worse than death. What did they do? They sold him as a slave. Sold him to the Ishmaelites, and they took him to Egypt as a slave. There are sometimes things that are worse than death, and slavery was considered worse than death because of the things that would take place in the slavery. And so Joseph, during this time period, as he was going to Egypt, there's a change that took place in his life. If you can place yourself in the position of Joseph, what would you feel as you're banished from home, as you're hated by your brothers, as you're going by the mountains that you can see your homeland, knowing that you can't do anything about it? And there was a time that Joseph gave himself up to utter grief and despair. But he made a resolution on his way to Egypt. And he was changed from that petted, tender child that was loved to a man that relied upon God. These are the trials that Joseph started out with. And as we face trials, it was spoken of earlier as God is not a God of vengeance. He is not a God of hatred. But these trials are designed to bring us closer to Him, to recognize our purpose in life, and to recognize His love for us, and to draw us closer to Him. All through life, all through Joseph's life, he was led by God's providences, as mysterious as that was. What happened when he got to what happened when he got to Egypt? Here he was, sold to Potiphar, captain of the guard. But God blessed Joseph here in Egypt, and as he was in Potiphar's home, he was determined to do all that he could to do right, and he stood for the principles that he had been taught as in his early years. And let's look in verse 4 of chapter 39 of Genesis. How he was treated in Potiphar's home. Verse 4. Let's back up to verse 3. And his master saw that the Lord was with him, and the Lord made all that he did to prosper in his hand. And Joseph found grace in his sight, and he served him. And he made him overseer over his house, and all that he had he put into his hand. And it came to pass for the time that he made him overseer in his house and over all that he had, that the Lord blessed the Egyptian's house for Joseph's sake, and the blessing of the Lord was upon all that he had in the house and in the field. So Joseph, in Egypt, how could he do that? Well, let me ask a different question. You know, when things happen to us and we become discouraged, depressed, can we function? There are those that become so depressed that they can't even function, can't even do the daily activities of life. And the only difference between how they are and what they can do is the mental condition of their thinking. If I were in Joseph's place, if I were in Potiphar's home, what would I think? How would I react to that? Would it be depressing? Would it be discouraging? I think for many of us, if not all of us, it would be. But Joseph didn't look at it in the way that he would have if he didn't have Christ in his heart. If he would have forgotten the training that he had. But he looked to God for his help, and he determined to be true to his God. Even amidst the surroundings of Potiphar and his home, when he was wrongfully accused with Potiphar's wife, he was assaulted by Potiphar's wife, wanting to assault his morals. And it came from one of the influence of the most likely to lead astray. Of all people, Potiphar's wife was the one that could be concealed. It could have been one that would not have been known. But yet, how promptly and firmly was his resistance. He suffered for his virtue and integrity. For she who would lead him astray revenged herself upon the virtue she could not subvert. So what happened to Joseph? Because of his virtue, because of his integrity, he was cast into prison. How often is it that we are tempted to do something that we think, well, we'll be better off if we do it this way, even though it may not be right. It will be better in the long run. The ends justify the means. But here Joseph recognized that he could not do this against God. He recognized his position. How often would we do something if we recognized God looks over us, looks after us, not as a revengeful God, but one that cares for us and seeks our good? So the acts of Joseph here, the action of him, caused him to be put into prison. So now you'd be discouraged. Now I'd be discouraged, depressed. Here I was doing all that I could. And because I did all that I could, I get put into prison. If we could but put ourselves in Joseph's shoes, could we recognize what he went through? I dare say that most people haven't seen a small percentage of what Joseph went through in his life. And they can't understand. But yet Joseph, because of this, he had compassion on others around him. In prison, what did he do? At first he was treated cruelly, but yet he looked after the prisoners, the fellow prisoners. And it was seen that Joseph was a benefit to the prison. And so he was exalted in prison itself. He did not spend his time in mourning over the injustice of his accusers, which had deprived him of his liberty. It's amazing to me how a person can stand up under adverse circumstances sometimes. I know we have seen in our day different people that have come under, it seems like, untold woe, untold sorrow, and yet they still stand firm. That is God's working in their lives. That is God's working His character in their life. And as Joseph was in prison, there were two that came to prison because they had offended the king, Pharaoh, for some small thing. And here they were in prison with Joseph. And they had a couple of dreams. And they were concerned about these dreams. Let's look at these dreams in verse 40, chapter 40, verse 5. Genesis 40, verse 5. And they dreamed a dream, both of them, each man his dream in one night, each man according to the interpretation of his dream. The butler and the baker of the king of Egypt, which were bound in the prison, and Joseph came in unto them in the morning, and looked upon them, and behold, they were sad. And he asked Pharaoh's officers that were with him in the ward of his Lord's house, saying, Wherefore look ye so sadly today? Why were they sad? They dreamed a dream, and they couldn't understand it. Yet they felt that there was some meaning behind this dream. Now Joseph had had some dreams, and he hadn't known his interpretation of his dreams, but yet here he asked them. It says, And he said unto them, We have dreamed a dream, and there is no interpreter of it. And Joseph said unto them, Do not interpretations belong to God? Tell me them, I pray you. Joseph didn't claim to be able to interpret dreams here, but he gave the credit to God. Even in the prison cell, he gave the honor to the Lord wherever he was. And of course, these dreams, one of them was restored back to his rightful position, or his position that he had before, the chief butler. And the baker was hanged, just as the dreams had told. But yet, there's another lesson that we can learn here. As the dreams were told to Joseph, Joseph recognized what would happen to the chief butler, that he would be put back in his former position, and he asked something of the butler. It says, when you get put into your position again, remember me. The butler was familiar with Joseph's story, how he was there, why he was in the dungeon wrongfully. And so he tenderly asked for the butler to remember him as he was being released. And sure enough, 3 days later, Pharaoh had a feast, and the butler was restored, and the baker was hanged. But the butler forgot. He didn't think about Joseph. Now, how does God regard that? Ingratitude by the Lord is as among the most grievous sins. Ingratitude. We were talking earlier this morning about the ones that the rain, the sun, falls on the just and the unjust. But how do the Christians view these things? Oftentimes we may go through a rainstorm, and as a Christian, we can look at the blessings of those. As a non-Christian, as a non-believer, it's a hindrance. Ingratitude. Ingratitude is a sin. And Joseph could have looked at his whole life and blamed God, blamed his circumstances, blamed his brothers, blamed his father for putting him into that position. But he didn't. 2 years he remained in prison after the dreams. 2 long years. And after he had been put into prison, after he had gotten all this wrong treatment to him, ingratitude was added to that. I suppose this was the bottom of Joseph's experience, in a way. Because Pharaoh had a dream then, and at that time, the butler recognized, he remembered Joseph. And he told Pharaoh of Joseph. And Joseph was brought out. And let's look at this experience. In verses 30, starting with 41, chapter 41, verse 30 in Genesis. We could go through the parable or the dream that he had, but I want to go beyond that. In verse 30, and there shall arise after them 7 years of famine, and all the plenty that shall be forgotten in the land of Egypt, and the famine shall consume the land. Here, Joseph was warning Pharaoh of what was coming. And so it says in verse 33, now therefore let Pharaoh look out a man discreet and wise, set him over the land of Egypt, and let Pharaoh do this. Let him appoint officers over the land, and take up the 5th part of the land of Egypt in the 7 plenteous years. And let them gather all the food of those good years, and come, and lay up corn under the hand of Pharaoh, and let them keep food in the cities. So here, Joseph gave a plan of what should happen. And of course, the only person that had the wisdom that Pharaoh felt that could do it would be Joseph himself. Did God put Joseph in that position? God put him in that position. If you remember Jacob in the land of Canaan, here he was, a small family, relatively small family. It's a large family today of 12, and then however many servants and all. But they were to multiply, but they couldn't. They had a problem, because how could they be in the land of Canaan? They would have to mingle with the Canaanites and be surrounded with the idolatry and such that was in the Canaanites. But God planned that they should have a spot that they could be protected, that they could serve Him freely and not be so confined to the customs of those around them. So So Joseph was placed in Egypt to make a way of help for them. There's some things, some lessons I think that are very interesting in the history of the sons of Jacob and what happened to their experience when they were found starving in Canaan. They heard that there was food in Egypt, and so they went to Egypt to find food. Now let's look in 42, chapter 42. In verse 1, Now when Jacob saw that there was corn in Egypt, Jacob said unto his sons, Why do ye look upon one upon another? And he said, Behold, I have heard that there is corn in Egypt. Get you down thither and buy for us from thence, that we may live and not die. And Joseph's 10 brothers went down to buy corn in Egypt. How many brothers did Joseph have? Had 11. But one did not go to Egypt. Why did that one not go to Egypt? Did he not have that a little bit of a favoritism as well? A little extra protection that the other ones didn't have? A little bit of what Joseph had had when he was younger? And so it had transferred to Benjamin a little bit there, I believe. And so the brothers went down to Egypt. And here it was, Joseph recognized his brothers. And as Joseph saw his brothers, he accused them. He accused them of being spies. Why would Joseph accuse them of being spies? Here they were, coming for food. Here Joseph recognized them. He knew who they were. And yet he accused them of being spies. He didn't show his lineage to them, his connection with them. And he noticed that Benjamin wasn't with them. And so he accused them of spies. He was afraid that Benjamin has fallen the same fate that he had fallen. So he cast them all into prison. Well, there's something that happened in the lives of Joseph's brothers. What had happened? During that time period of several years that had taken place between when Joseph was ruler of the kingdom and when he was been sold, there was also some things that the Lord had worked in their characters as well. And the Lord had transformed their characters to be different than what they were. And as they were talking among themselves, it says, We are very verily guilty concerning our brother, in that we saw the anguish of his soul when he besought us, and we would not hear. Therefore is this distress come upon us. And they knew not that Joseph understood them, for he spake to them by an interpreter. Oftentimes we suffer the consequences of our own sin, don't we? And Joseph's brothers recognized that what was happening to them was a consequence of what they had done. And so Joseph had put them into prison, and recognizing that their the family would be suffering, he decided to save Simeon in prison and send the rest back home to feed the children and all. Now, there's something that takes place at home. As they come home, how are they received at home? The money is in their sacks. I encourage you, by the way, to go back and read the story. There's lots of details in the story that we could learn, that we can glean. And so I'm skipping a lot, but trying to get the lessons, some of the lessons that I feel that stand out to me. But as they got home, they found the money in their sacks. And this disturbed them because they had already been accused of being spies. And now that their money was in their sacks, they could only see bad coming from that. And Joseph had said, "Only if your brother Benjamin be with you can you see my face again." The famine goes on. Another year. This is only the second year of the famine, so the famine extended into Canaan just as well as Egypt. And it's amazing to me that even with all the preparation of the food being stored, that it was able to supply not only the food for Egypt, but the surrounding nations as well. It must have been a stretching of the food even at that, because a fifth part of the food was stored every year. And if you figure that out, that means it should have lasted for 5 years or so beyond. You know, a fifth part is not very much if you take that year by year. So it shouldn't have lasted, it doesn't seem like to me, for the Egyptians and the surrounding nations. But yet, God, I believe, provided for the nations around. Now the dilemma comes when they're hungry again. Jacob would not send Benjamin. He'd already determined not to do that, but yet he had no choice. And Judah said something to his father. Judah stands out to be a remarkable personality there. Judah assures his father that he will be surety for his brother, that if he would send him with them, they would go. And if he did not bring Benjamin back, he would bear the blame of it forever. Judah pledged himself to be a surety for Benjamin. So Joseph sees his brothers come again, and he prepares this table for them, prepares this feast for them. But yet he orders them seats them in order from oldest to youngest, which surprises the brothers, because who would know that? He sees Benjamin with them. And imagine the joy that Joseph had to see Benjamin there, and the emotions that would take place in his heart as he saw Benjamin, his beloved brother, with them. And the thought that the hand of the Lord had been against them for their past wickedness was turned because of how they had been served there in Joseph's home. They were convinced that the Lord was with them again. And I'd like to glance at the story of how, just touch on the story of how the brothers went home, how Benjamin was found to have the cup in his sack and brought back. And here they are, once again, before Joseph. Who was condemned? Benjamin was condemned. Benjamin was the one that would be faced with either serfdom, being a servant, or condemned to die. And the rest of the brothers were able to go free. What would they do? In the experience of their past life, they were willing to sell Joseph as a slave. They were willing to get rid of him as a slave. They were wanting to do away with his dreams, that they wouldn't come true. And the very thing that they did made the dreams come true of Joseph. And now, as the working of the various circumstances in each of their lives brought virtue into Joseph, but I think as I have looked at this story, I recognize the virtue that was in Joseph. And I don't discount that at all, because of the terrible heartache that he went through, yet he stood firm. But to me, it's more remarkable with the brothers of Joseph, because they were much more outgoing or expressive of their vileness. They were willing to let their brothers suffer. They were willing to have no heart whatsoever for their brother, sell him into slavery, worse than kill him. But they didn't want to kill him because they didn't want the blood on them. And so here his brothers, how could they become virtuous? But yet, in the time period that transpired between Joseph being sold and them coming to Egypt at this last time, told a change in their character. And here Benjamin was going to be a slave, and they were ready to go home. But I'd like to read this here of Judah. Judah spoke to Joseph aside from the rest, and related to him the reluctance of his father to let Benjamin come with the rest of them to Egypt, that he pledged himself to become surety for Benjamin, that if he brought him not to his father, he would bear the blame forever. He eloquently pleaded in behalf of his father, relating his great grief at the loss of Joseph, and that Benjamin was all that was left of the mother which his father loved, and that if Benjamin should be separated from his father, he would die. For his life was bound up in the lad's life. Judah then nobly offered to become a slave instead of his brother, for he could not meet his father without Benjamin with him. Said Judah, Now therefore, I pray thee, let thy servant abide instead of the lad, a bondman to my Lord, and let the lad go up with his brethren. How would you feel if you were pleading for your own daughter, son, brother, sister, or even someone that you loved, pleading that they would go free, pleading that they would be able to live and you put in their position? This is what Christ has done for us. We have been placed in a position like Benjamin. Now we know Benjamin's story. We know that Joseph wouldn't have put him as a slave. But that's how he was. And that's how we are. We are bound under sin. And Christ is pleading, has pled for us, that his life would take the place of our life, that we might go free. This is the transformation of character that took place in the brothers' lives. And to me it's remarkable that that could happen in such a life. And but for the grace of God, that is us as well. As the brothers were, that is us as well, but for the grace of God. The transformation of character is the work of a lifetime. Sanctification is the work of a lifetime. And as we look to Christ for our hope, for our salvation. If we recognize the pleading of Christ for us, of our sins, that He is willing to take the place in our lives, take the place of death for us, that we might have life. If we could just but understand that just a little bit better. I'd like to look at Philippians 4:8. Philippians 4:8. Finally, brethren, whatsoever things are true, whatsoever things are honest, whatsoever things are just, whatsoever things are pure, whatsoever things are lovely, whatsoever things are of a good report, if there be any virtue, and if there be any praise, think on these things. Let us take from our lives those things that defile, those things that draw us down, those things that turn our minds away from God to the earth. Had Joseph wavered and fallen under the first temptation, his strength would have been insufficient for the second test. It is important that we do not take a wrong step in any direction, for it is unprofitable to us. Whatever it may cost you, add to your faith virtue.